Let's do it!
MainMan.
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 MainMan. All the people that were working for MainMan were unusual.
We were loud, ugly Americans, basically.
MainMan. An interesting story, a very entertaining story, a very long, wonderful adventure.
Hello and welcome to episode 66 in our series exploring the history of MainMan, which was the groundbreaking management rights company founded by entrepreneur Tony Defries, which completely transformed the way artists forged their careers.
So they were kind of just wild times, people floating in and out. Freddie Beretti, the dress designer, I think he was in the basement. Maybe Ava Cherry was there for a while. There was always something happening. It was you never had boring moments. I look back at my time with MainMan and it was just colourful, having a whale of a time.
MainMan worked with legendary artists in the 70s like John Mellencamp, Mott the Hoople, Dana Gillespie, Mick Ralphs, Lou Reed, Marianne Faithfull, Iggy Pop, Amanda Lear and David Bowie.
Like the Diamond Dogs thing where they airbrush the dick off, I mean, I was having more erasure problems. It followed me all through the 70s. I nearly started a riot with the Americans and they said, oh, we can't show that, that's subversive.
In this episode, we're marking the 50th anniversary of the release of the Diamond Dogs album, and Tony explains how Bowie approached the writing and recording of the album, especially the story behind David's original concept, which was to write a musical based on one of his favourite novels.
When I first began working with David Bowie, who was then David Robert Jones, he was very insecure, very uncertain. His real talent that I could see initially in 1970 when I met him was writing songs that told stories, songs that were indicative of something more important than the individual that was sitting in front of me. David was not impressive as a live person. He was shy, he wasn't confident, and he hadn't developed any real performing skills. All of that was yet to come. And now, here we are in 2024, and we're looking back at one of the things that allowed David to become Bowie, that allowed that movement into superstar status, the beginning of it at least. And part of that was based on the mutual friendship that David and I had. Starting from my first advice to him and Angela was do nothing, wait for me to arrange your freedoms from publishing and recording contracts that are not in your favour and that need to be terminated. And whilst we're doing that, we'll take care of your finances in such a way that David can continue to write new songs for new recordings and rehearse with musicians who could become a performing live band. All of that can be done. How long will that take? Initially, we can reduce some of those contracts, publishing, management. They're relatively easy, which means we could create new ones and get new advances. But the recording contract, the Mercury contract, the one that is the most binding, is also the one that's the most important. We need to get control of your recordings, especially in America, but ultimately worldwide, before we can move forward. So this I explained to David and Angela, and David was absolutely delighted that he wouldn't have to go and do work of drawing and basically copying other people's material, which is what he was doing to be able to make some money. He wasn't very good at it, so he didn't make a lot of money. And Angela, of course, didn't do very much of anything at all. Initially, she didn't have skills that would allow her to work in the UK, and as soon as she got pregnant and had Zoe, she was largely out of the picture. Her only real function was maintaining David's confidence and essentially being his biggest supporter in those early years when he was often very despondent, didn't believe that things were going to happen. Unfortunately, we did quite quickly get a new publishing deal with Chrysalis, which for the first time meant that A, David and Angela had money, and B, they had credit which we arranged via their bank so that they could spend money on necessary things and or career-related events or things, costumes, etc. And at the same time, they would have a level of financial security for general purposes and living. Now, it took us a while to get out of the Mercury contract, but then we were able to go and make recordings which attracted the interest of specifically RCA, although many others were interested, but RCA were willing to make the sort of deal we needed, and the deal was a lease tape arrangement that allowed us to get our recordings. I say our recordings now because these are recordings made by David for the Gem company that I was then working with, and those recordings were going to be licensed to RCA worldwide for 10 years. So they would come back in the early 80s and give us essentially the right to do new things and keep that old catalogue. So, fast forward to 1974. We've retired Ziggy very successfully and with great press, and now the question is, what's Bowie going to do next? The idea of using the Orwell narrative has largely been abandoned. But when we explore it a little bit, it turns out that it can actually be used, just not in the same form, and rather that we begin looking at an alternative story. One of the early identifiers for that we've spoken about before was the 1980 floor show done for the Midnight Special TV program in the US, but actually done at the Marquee Club in London, where some of the seeds, the early beginnings of what became Diamond Dogs sprout. How do we get to Diamond Dogs replacing 1984? I remember sitting down with David and Angela, where David begins to explore with drawings and mime and a very fortunately available large trunk, things that he could do on stage. He starts drawing scaffolding towers that we could put on stage that would represent what we get to call Hunger City, that there could be a bridge inspired by the concerts he'd done at Radio City Music Hall, where they did have both a catapult and a bridge. Now David wants us to put that catapult and bridge into a touring scenario. The idea that you're going to be able to take this to many different venues in America is completely unique at this point in time. Nobody, no rock and roll performer, no country and western performer, no musical performer of any sort goes on the road with a full theatrical, movable set, especially not one that weighs 23 tons and contains thousands of different pieces. It takes a whole day to assemble and requires enormous amounts of people and usually resistance from local unions to put it up. That's what we were proposing to do, and that's what we eventually did. But for this moment in time, imagine a skinny David, an equally skinny Angela, in a hotel room with David and I discussing how we might effectively bring that Radio City performance into a live touring environment by stripping it down and just keeping the best bits, albeit not easy. David making his little hand-drawn sketches, which he wasn't very good at drawing actually, even though he'd been apparently trained for it, but still, there they were. And climbing in and out of a trunk that actually served as the inspiration for what became the diamond that would roll on stage during the performance, being hidden from the audience until that moment in time. And the diamond was very large. It needed to be, because inside the diamond there was a gigantic hand, and when the hand extended and stretched out to the audience, in its palm was David's singing time. And then he climbed down, or walked down, a little staircase that was in the thumb of the hand, carefully placed, still singing. And the audiences, without question, without exception, went wild for that, loved that. Now, we've got to do this now. We've talked about it. We've got little drawings. How do we actually make this happen? One, can you hear thunder, by the way, Des, just by the by?
Yes, I can hear very loud thunder. I just assumed it was you being very clever and recreating the doom and dystopia of Diamond Dog's Hunger City for dramatic effect. It's very evocative and atmospheric, in keeping with the theme.
Very atmospheric. So now, what we need to do to move this forward, obviously then, and by the way, at this point in time, we're back in New York, and this is happening in the New York hotel. We need to bring people on who might be able to pull this off. So the first thing we do is arrange for a meeting with the director of Equus, which had been very successful as a stage production, and then of course became a film. And we also approach Jules Fisher, who is most probably the best lighting designer in the world, certainly in America. And Jules has done lighting for many, many different theatrical shows, for many films. For example, All That Jazz was lit by Jules, and he is in touch with the kind of designers that we will need to do this. So we select a design team, 2 designers and support from their existing teams, and Jules and his folk to do the lighting. Then we need a venue to actually start working on this, and we also need RCA to come on board and help us do it. So I asked Jules to make me a model to scale of what we've decided on as the set, the bridge, the catapult, the diamond, and in the center of all of this we'll have a little scale Bowie singing, although the model won't sing. But visually there'll be a Bowie figure. All this has to be put into a see-through perspex box. And why do I need this? I need this so that I can go to RCA and take this out of a cardboard box and persuade them to finance the building, the development, the design, and get it on the road. As I said, nobody's ever done this before. The idea that you can do it and that it will be completely unique for any musical or rock performer to go out with this kind of show and to move it into arenas all over America, if not the world, is astonishing and possibly unlikely, but certainly different. We have a budget for the set and rehearsal time at a dedicated theatre in New Jersey, and that amounts in $1974 to $600,000 so that we can get started. In today's money, that is over $3.5 million. So here we are essentially asking RCA for $3.5 million to launch a theatrical extravaganza for a rock star who's yet to have a hit single in America. And astonishingly enough, they agree and they support the entire idea. And part of that is because we've promised a new album which is called Diamond Dogs and which features many of the songs from previous recordings, but also provides many new songs and astonishing artwork. Diamond Dogs was inspired, from David's perspective this is, by a song that Iggy had performed on his Elektra album called The Stooges, and it was a song that Iggy was performing live during that era, which was 1969, before we started working with him, called I Want to Be Your Dog. This is where the idea of creating dogs as characters came from. David had seen the Guy Pilat book. Guy Pilat was an artist who had created a book of drawings of rock figures, on the cover of which he places Elvis, Jagger, Lennon and Bowie as four mainstream, obviously, characters, performers in the rock pantheon. Pilat does an astonishing album cover in which David is featured as a dog with two female dogs on either side, and where we had to blank out the genitalia in order for it to go on sale in America. Otherwise they would have had huge problems with distributors and other folk. But in the meantime, there's also a marvelously surreal working of Hunger City, which is most likely drawn from pictures of New York, and then amongst other versions that don't show up on the album, there's David with an enormous dog. All of these images, initially in black and white, were copied by us and provided as an image file. This is long ago, remember, this is 50 years ago, so there was no way to actually give magazines and any kind of press outlets images that they might reuse unless A, they were black and white, and B, they were just photographs that could be reproduced. It was very successful in the sense that all of a sudden many different publications all over America started reproducing these extraordinary images, which led to a lot of curiosity and essentially built up an audience for what would become the most extravagant and essentially most astonishing theatrical rock and roll event. You can't call them performances because they were much more like events. Multiple cast members, multiple numbers, actors on stage pretending to fight, pretending make-up, make-believe structures like boxing rings made out of ropes. David predating Basquiat by a huge number of years by making himself an image wearing boxing gloves. And Basquiat then, much later, made a famous painting of himself wearing boxing gloves. These are all the things that we did, and many more. And of course, David on the bridge singing, David in the capsule doing Space Oddity, and the idea and the description of Hunger City, influenced possibly by Burroughs. It's probably a derivative, Future Legend may be a derivative of Burroughs, but certainly Ziggy becomes a different character. He becomes Halloween Jack, famously rendered in the Diamond Dogs song, and the entire show becomes a series of set pieces which are marked by songs, and one of the most impressive of these is the diamond. So we had designed or commissioned the design of a gigantic diamond, much larger than life, that was actually put on the chassis of a Chevrolet, powered by batteries. So in a way we were ahead of the EV movement back then. Only our EV only had to travel from the back of the stage to centre stage. It wasn't a very long distance, powered by heavy-duty cables bringing voltage on board. And then, when it got to centre stage and sparkled and glittered and was lit up in a way that would make it very, very much a very large diamond, then, as time begins to play, the diamond opens, and inside there is a very, very large black velvet hand, and in the palm of that hand, which stretches out to touch the stage, is a small figure of Bowie curled up singing time. He carried on singing. He walks down a concealed stairway in the thumb of the hand, and after the initial shock, the audience go completely wild. These were the kind of effects that you could only achieve with a great deal of rehearsal and a lot of backstage people, and of course a significant amount of money to spend. But ultimately all of that survived, and we did a number of dates until we got to California and did the Universal Amphitheatre, and that was our best set of dates. Everybody came, and everybody means that Diana Ross came, Elizabeth Taylor came, Streisand came, all of the Hollywood folk came. And our choreographer at that point in time, who had worked for us before this but was now working for us again, was Toni Basil, and she was already well known in Hollywood as a choreographer who had tried her hand at being a pop star, which gave her one single but didn't really work out, but who was frequently hired by us in the 70s to do choreography for Bowie. On the album and in the show, Future Legend features by beginning with the background music of Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, which is quite a nice way to begin. In the death, as the last few corpses lay rotting on the slimy thoroughfare, the shutters lifted inches in Temperance Building high on Poacher's Hill, and red mutant eyes gazed down on Hunger City. No more big wheels, fleas the size of rats sucked on rats the size of cats, and 10,000 peoploids split into small tribes, coveting the highest of the sterile skyscrapers, like packs of dogs assaulting the glass fronts of Love Avenue, ripping and rewrapping mink and shiny silver fox, now leg warmers, family badge of sapphire and cracked emerald. Any day now, the year of the Diamond Dogs. This ain't rock and roll, this is genocide. That was David's intro called Future Legend, very much derived from William Burroughs' writing and tremendously, dramatically dark, inspiring, most likely, many dystopian work. For example, we might think that Hunger Games, the successful series of novels and films, is also harked back to this idea of Hunger City, particularly because we had, against this backdrop, when it was live on stage, you actually had, in the form of these towers that were essentially flats that could be erected, but they were scaffold-supported towers on stage, properly lit, what the audience was seeing, what looked like a city, albeit, and they looked at it as the influence. Much later, a decade later, a filmmaker who'd been a photographer and not yet a filmmaker, but often hired to make commercials, Ridley Scott, was asked by Apple to work on their new and the first personal computer. Apple wanted to explore the idea of 1984 because they were going to provide that commercial to the Super Bowl for that year, and it would be introduced, the computer itself, the PC, would become available that year. George Orwell's wife turned down the request to use 1984, and Ridley Scott came up with the idea of transposing some part of the theme of 1984, which was also the theme of an earlier, much earlier movie by a German filmmaker, Fritz Lang. That film was called Metropolis, and that film inspired Ridley, but much earlier again inspired David to explore the idea of an underclass of people who in the Metropolis version were the workers, in David's version became what he calls the peopleoids, and in Ridley's version became the people who could be enabled by. So he has, in the commercial that was run for the Super Bowl, a girl throwing something at a screen that features a Big Brother image talking, and she's wearing a Mac computer. The uncertainty amongst many folk at Apple and the advertising agency was resolved when, because it was so different, so unique and so unusual, the clips from the commercial, clips from the Super Bowl outing, were actually then repeated on many news stations all over America, and orders came in for the PC to the tune of 3.5 million PCs sold after that commercial ran. Apple never used the commercial again and have not made it available since then. But the idea of using that sort of impression, that narrative, was clearly a very successful outing for Ridley, and certainly helped move him towards making feature films that had very often, the first of them for sure, like Blade Runner, like Aliens, had a very specific future or futuristic feel and subject matter. And that was also where David, way ahead of his time here, was taking the music narrative, which had been Ziggy, now into a whole new world of Diamond Dogs.
Tony Defries recalling the period in Bowie's career when he wrote, recorded and toured in support of the now iconic Diamond Dogs album 50 years ago. There are some great pieces of memorabilia from the Diamond Dogs era on the MainMan label website, along with a huge collection of other historic documents including articles, telexes, letters and production notes, many of them never seen before, that we're adding to the MainMan label website each week. It's a great record of a very exciting period in rock history. That's mainmanlabel.com. And on the website, you can also check out the other episodes in the MainMan series. I'm Des Shaw, and this is a Zinc Media Tech production. Thanks for listening.